purpose of this research paper was to determine if ants exhibited a government structure, as seen by the title page. Why ants out of everything else? Well, personally, they've always been a subject of my fascination. I think that the way they organize themselves in their colonies, the way that they have been able to spread across the globe, they're all very interesting to me. Also, they're eusocial insects, and eusociality is something which implies that they have the highest level of organization out of any animal species. So ants, wasps, bees, and dolphins are considered eusocial animals because they have very complex forms of communication and can organize themselves in ways that are, complex. Also, they're polymorphic. They have different castes, and that is just that if a larvae is fed more whenever they're still developing, their exoskeleton will evolve in their lifetime when it's hardening, and so they end up being specialized, as shown by Dornhaus's work. They feed each other through a mouth-to-mouth process known as trophallaxis, and this is used to recruit ants for different tasks, whether it's foraging, fixing the colony walls, or tending to the larvae. They leave pheromone trails, which will become very important later on, and according to a peer-reviewed source by Wildenberg, a colony of Argentine ants has actually spread all the way from Argentina into Europe, which is contendable from the field, but it's nonetheless something that has impressed me personally. So, why governance then? Well, because they're a eusocial insect, a lot of myrmecologists or ant scientists have thrown around the comparison between ant colonies and government structures. The main difference being that government structures in our worlds tend to be bureaucratic. They have to get legislation passed. It's very slow at making decisions, whereas ant colonies, with all of the ants in unison, it seems to go very smoothly. It seems to bypass the major problem that governments have today. And the things in the real world are being modeled after ant colonies, slowly by slowly. There's ant colony optimization, which is a computer science term. It's just an algorithm that speeds up processing. There are new traffic light systems that are being installed based off of how ants go foraging. Mass mentality is a new field of study that people are looking into, and they're basing that off of how ants go out to forage, and they're using that to apply it to humans when it comes to crowds. And so we can see that ants are comparable to governments, and that there are a lot that governments and society can learn from ant colonies. So the research question, the big question that we're asking is, through qualitative meta-analysis of work studying ant species organization, such as that displayed by the Singaporean Camponotus maculatus, can colonies be attributed with a government structure? And this question was inspired by works by the two famous myrmecologists, E.O. Wilson and Bert Holdobler. They both have asked similar questions, but so far nothing has been asked comparing government structures using human society's terms for a government and applying that to a colony. So that is the gap in the research. So the government types that we will be looking at are limited to these four here, and they're based off of Plato's 5 regimes, which he believed were the fundamental forms of the government, which were democracy, oligarchy, timocracy, aristocracy, and tyranny. We will only be using democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, which will be explained later. But democracy has been defined as rule of the many, oligarchy has been defined as rule of the few, monarchy is rule of the individual, and anarchy is rule of none or the absence of rule, where rule is defined as the power to make colony-wide decisions and policy. So, other key definitions, of course, myrmecology, the study of ants. A myrmecologist is an ant scientist, and eusociality, as explained earlier, is the most complex form of organization in animal society. So, the limitations of this paper will be that we'll only be assessing colonies for the government structures mentioned here. We won't be looking at any other sort of like military juntas because they don't apply to colonies. We'll only be assessing single queen colonies as exemplified by the Singaporean Camponotus maculatus. Other polygynous or multi-queen colonies bend the rules when it comes to organization of colonies, and so those won't be looked into. We will be limiting the definitions of the government structures to the definitions we set out here, and again, these are based off of how Plato defined them, and we won't be using oligarchy or timocracy, but we will be including anarchy. So we've adapted Plato's 5 regimes, and this is simply because Timocracy and aristocracy, sorry, we will be using oligarchy. Timocracy and aristocracy are both rule of the few. However, Aristotle has associated aristocracy with an elite philosopher king and timocracy with a corrupted oligarchy. So in essence, they're both rule of the few, but we've taken out the human philosophical aspect just so that we can apply it to an ant colony. So we will be looking at this question through a meta-analysis. This means that all information gathered to support the findings will be from peer-reviewed sources, ideally from myrmecologists. And one may ask why? Why not use an experimental sort of method? Well, because the question we're asking is qualitative, and while this may seem arbitrary because one can just decide, meta-analysis will be giving expert opinions and expert testimony to what the findings are. So all of the findings will be grounded in facts found from professionals who've researched this their entire lives. So what is the significance of this question? Currently, it's significant because there's a gap in the research. There are lots of myrmecologists, such as E.O. Wilson, such as Debbie Castle, who have compared ant colonies to a government structure. However, they don't explain what or how the colony is that government structure. For example, E.O. Wilson, in his work, says that ant colonies are a mass heterarchy, and he uses that to explain how information travels through prophylaxis, but it's a comparison word that he uses and he doesn't really explain. And because it's not explained, and it's just a term or a comparison thrown around so that ant myrmecologists can explain their work, it's possible that ant colonies don't exemplify a government structure, and it's also possible that myrmecologists have been identifying the wrong type of government that ants most exemplify. And so the thesis for this work will be taking a stance that first, ant colonies do exemplify a government structure, and secondly, that they exhibit a democratic organization, that is, rule of the many. And so if ants do, in fact, exemplify a government structure, then hopefully this can be adapted into human society, and this work can be a springboard for further research into this topic. Now, the findings that we had after reviewing all of our works, I've broken it up into the 4 government types that we were exploring. As far as tyranny goes, there was one source that backed this up. This was Hammond's work, Policing the Relative Conflicts of Insects, and this was only in polygynous colonies, which we decided were out of the scope of this research. And the only backing that he had was that whenever one queen dies in a polygynous colony, the other queen has some sway in the worker ants. It's very confusing, it's out of the scope of this, so tyranny was not found to be the form of government that colonies exemplify. Oligarchy, some myrmecologists have said, like Castle, have said that when ants go slave making, that those enslaved ants don't actually have a sway on what the colony does. Also, they say that larvae is excluded. So in Kennedy's work, he states that termites use larvae for labor. They use larvae, and that larvae can decide what the colony does. However, ants, because their exoskeleton is still hardening when they're larvae, are excluded from any policy making or decision making that happens in the colony. But for the most part, enslaved ants are not part of the original colony, and larvae aren't fully developed, so this didn't have as strong of a backing as the others. Democracy, ants use prophylaxis to recruit other ants for tasks, which ends up in them dropping pheromone trails, which recruits. In turn, it's cyclical, and they recruit more ants for this process. However, every ant ultimately can do whatever they please, and that pheromone trail or prophylaxis can be used as evidence as like a vote in what the policy is. You'll notice that democracy and anarchy aren't actually, they don't have citation set to them. This is because every single source used and put in the footer earlier actually supports both democracy and anarchy. Finally, anarchy was the most substantiated government form out of them all, because although prophylaxis and pheromones can be seen as a democratic form of government, ultimately there is no stop and start to these democratic votes, and because there is no governing body which enforces the decision of ants, they can do whatever they please in contradiction to the colony. So, is human society capable of the organized anarchy that ants display? In Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, he argues no, because humans have an incentive to pass on their genetic their genetic identity, and ants do not. This means that ants don't come into conflict with one another as humans would. However, if we can get to a point where human society deregulates power, then it's possible that one day governments will be able to form themselves off of ants' organized anarchy. And in Samuel Huntington's Journal of Democracy, he proposed that 3 waves of democratization are slowly but surely devolving power to the people. And so we can see that there is a possibility in the long run that eventually governments will organize themselves based off of ants. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Robert, I just want to turn your attention back to your method section. My question is, you said that researchers have basically studied ants their entire lives. You are basing this on a meta-analysis. Can you talk about either Dawkins or Huntington, any of the Wilson? Can you talk about any of them that have actually used meta-analysis in their own research?
Yeah, actually, Huntington and Dawkins that I mentioned in this slide, those are political scientists. This is the application of it. However, E.O. Wilson and Bert Holdobler, the people that I based my thesis off of, in their Journey to the Ants work, they actually used a meta-analysis combined with an experimental study. And so they were making a claim, but then to substantiate it, the entirety of the second half of their work was a meta-analysis factor. So it was actually experimental meta-analysis. Also, there was another source that I used by Kennedy, I believe, which was purely just meta-analysis, and that was making a model for ant societies, how they actually go and forage for food.
Okay. You mentioned in your your work that you've defined governments in 3 different ways. You said that you're going to use, Plato has 5, you're going to use 3, but then in the findings you mentioned 4. Is it 4 or 3?
So Plato had 5 originally.
Right.
And then democracy and aristocracy were taken out.
Okay.
Just to apply rule of the few, rule of the many, and rule of...
Can you go back to your findings slide just really quickly?
Sure.
And I think if I heard you correctly, you wanted just to mention tyranny because of the polygynous colony, correct?
Well,
is that why that's there?
So Plato's 5 government types had tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy in them. And so the way that he defined those were rule of an individual, rule of the few, and rule of the many. And then I also included anarchy, which is rule of the none, or absence of rule, just because that would fill the last kind of spectrum of power devolution. Okay.
I think I just was unclear, but it's 4 that you're really...
It's 4, 3 of them are from Plato's 5.
Got it. I think that's just... All right, good. I think I'm going to